The massive space station called Valora 7 floated in the darkness between three different star systems, and it served as the home of the most famous school in the entire galaxy, where young beings from dozens of different worlds came to learn about the universe and each other. On this particular morning, something unusual was about to happen, because a human was walking through the main entrance for the very first time in the history of the station. His name was Kyle Bennett, and he was 23 years old, with brown hair that fell across his forehead, and calm gray eyes that took in everything around him without showing any fear or worry. He had grown up in a small town in Montana, surrounded by mountains and forests and all kinds of wild animals, and his father had taught him to hunt and track and survive in the wilderness from the time he could walk. Now he was millions of miles from that quiet mountain home, standing in a hallway filled with aliens who looked at him like he was the strangest creature they had ever seen. A group of Corvani students passed by, their 7-foot-tall bodies covered in shimmering scales that changed color based on their emotions. And right now, those scales were shifting to a nervous yellow as they stared at the small human. Kyle just nodded politely and kept walking toward his first class. The Falathi were easier to look at because they resembled large cats that walked on two legs, with silver or golden fur and big expressive eyes, and they moved with a grace that reminded Kyle of the mountain lions back home. One young Falathi female stopped in the middle of the hallway when she saw him, her ears flattening against her skull and her tail puffing up to twice its normal size. Kyle smiled at her, trying to seem friendly, but the smile only made her back away faster, and he wondered what exactly the galactic community had been told about humans. The classroom for Xenobiology, 401, was a large circular room with seats arranged in rising rows like a stadium, and when Kyle walked in, every conversation stopped immediately. Professor Thalvek stood at the center of the room, a Corvani with 4 arms and scales that were currently a calm blue, though they flickered to orange when he noticed the human student. "Ah, yes," the professor said through his translator device, which converted his clicking native language into words Kyle could understand. "Our exchange student from Earth has arrived, and I trust everyone will make him feel welcome." Nobody moved or spoke. Kyle found a seat near the back of the room and pulled out his tablet, trying to ignore the dozens of eyes and other sensory organs that were all focused on him. The same Falathi female from the hallway was sitting 2 rows ahead, and she kept turning around to look at him with those big golden eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and something that looked very much like fear. Her name was Saralyn, according to the class roster that Kyle had studied before arriving, and she was one of the top students in the program. The professor cleared his throat, which for a Corvani involved making a sound like rocks grinding together, and began the lecture. "Today we will be studying apex predators from across known space," Thalvek announced, "and we will examine what makes certain species so effective at hunting and killing their prey." Kyle perked up at this, because it was a subject he actually knew something about, having grown up surrounded by some of Earth's most dangerous predators. "I should warn all of you," the professor continued, "that we will be playing audio recordings of these predators, and some of you may find the sounds deeply disturbing." A nervous murmur went through the classroom. "Your instincts may tell you to run or hide, and that is perfectly normal, as these are the responses that kept your ancestors alive on your home worlds." Kyle settled back in his chair, curious about what kinds of sounds could scare so many different species. The Drevnok, sitting 3 rows to his left, was already trembling, and they were literally made of rock, with bodies that looked like boulders stacked on top of each other and held together by some kind of biological cement. If something could scare a creature made of solid stone, Kyle thought, it must be pretty impressive. The lights in the classroom dimmed, and the professor activated the main display screen. Our first specimen is the Vorthax of Kepler 442b, Thalvek explained. A creature so deadly that it drove 3 sentient species to extinction before the Galactic Council authorized its containment. An image appeared on the screen, showing something that looked like a cross between a centipede and a great white shark, with hundreds of legs and a mouth that seemed to split its entire body in half. Hit, with interest, noting the way its body was designed for speed and the placement of its sensory organs, which suggested it hunted primarily by detecting vibrations in the ground. Then the recording began to play. A deep rumbling growl filled the classroom, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor and up through the seats, and all around Kyle, students began to panic. The Philathes fur stood on end, making her look twice her normal size, and several Corvani changed to pure white, which Kyle had learned meant absolute terror. Even the rocky Drevnuk was shaking so hard that small pebbles were falling off its body. Kyle listened carefully to the sound, tilting his head slightly as he analyzed it. It was impressive, he had to admit, like the bellow of an alligator mixed with the rumble of distant thunder, but it was not really that different from sounds he had heard back home in Montana. His father had taken him to Louisiana once to visit relatives, and they had gone out into the swamps at night to listen to the gators calling to each other. And this Vorthax sounded a lot like those gators, just deeper and louder. The recording ended, and students around the room slowly began to relax, though their colors and postures still showed signs of stress. Professor Thalvek looked pleased with the reaction, and Kyle could tell that scaring students was probably one of his favorite parts of this particular lecture. As you can see, the professor said, or rather, as you can hear, the Vorthax uses infrasound to paralyze its prey before striking, and the psychological effect of its call is nearly universal across all known species. Kyle raised his hand. The professor's scales flickered to a surprised purple, and he pointed one of his forearms at the human. Yes, Mr. Bennett, do you have a question about the Vorthax? Not really a question, Kyle said, but I was wondering if you have any recordings of predators from Earth, because I noticed the Vorthax sounds a lot like an alligator, and I thought it might be interesting to compare them. The entire classroom went silent. Sarah Lynn turned around completely in her seat to stare at him, and Kyle could see that her pupils had dilated to full circles. You have heard sounds like this before? The professor asked, his scales shifting through several colors that Kyle did not recognize. Sure, Kyle said with a shrug. Gators make that kind of noise all the time, especially during mating season when the big males are trying to impress the females. Professor Thalvek was quiet for a long moment, and then his scales settled into a thoughtful gray. I do have some recordings from Earth, he said slowly, but I had planned to save them for the end of the lecture, as they are considered among the most disturbing in our entire collection. Kyle smiled, wondering what Earth predator could possibly be scary enough to impress a classroom full of aliens who traveled between stars. He was about to find out. The second recording began almost immediately, and this time the sound was completely different from the deep rumble of the Vorthax. It started as a high-pitched whistle that climbed higher and higher until it became a series of sharp, piercing shrieks that seemed to stab directly into the brain. Kyle watched as Sarah Lynn covered her large ears with her paws and pressed herself down against her desk, trying to make herself as small as possible. The Corvani students were changing colors so fast that they looked like broken rainbow machines, and one of them actually fell out of his chair and curled up on the floor. This is the Shriek Hunter of Glee's 667C, Professor Thalvek explained, his voice strained as he fought against his own instincts. A creature that uses echolocation to hunt in complete darkness and has been known to clear entire colonies within hours. Kyle nodded to himself, because the sound reminded him of something he had heard many times before. When he was 7 years old, he had been camping with his father in a barn on their property, waiting for a deer to come to the salt lick they had set up. And in the middle of the night, he had heard the most terrifying scream of his life. He had grabbed his father's arm, absolutely certain that a woman was being murdered somewhere nearby. But his father had just laughed quietly and explained that it was only a barn owl. Those birds could make sounds that seemed to come straight from a horror movie, and this shriek hunter sounded almost exactly the same, just louder and with more echoes. The recording ended, and Kyle could hear students around the room gasping and whimpering as they tried to recover. The shriek hunter's call operates on frequencies specifically designed to trigger panic responses in prey species, the professor continued. An exposure to the sound for more than a few minutes can cause permanent psychological damage. About all the nights he had spent camping in the woods, listening to owls and coyotes and foxes make sounds that most city people would never believe came from real animals. He wondered how his classmates would react to the sound of a fox screaming in the middle of the night, because that was a noise that could make even experienced outdoorsmen jump out of their sleeping bags. The third recording was different again. A series of clicking and chattering sounds that built up into a horrible buzzing roar, like a million insects all screaming at once. Several students actually ran for the door, and the professor had to pause the lecture to let them leave. The hive mind of Proxima Centauri b, Thalvek said, a collective organism that absorbs other life forms into itself and uses their voices to create this terrifying chorus. Kyle made a note on his tablet, comparing the sound to the noise that cicadas made during their emergence years, when billions of them died in lengthy numbers, like a million insects, all screaming, "Once you are present." Insects would all emerge from the ground at once and fill the air with their overwhelming drone. The fourth recording was a wet gurgling sound mixed with what sounded like bones cracking, and Kyle had to admit this one was pretty unpleasant, though it reminded him more of a garbage disposal than any animal he knew. The depth stalker of Europa, the professor announced, a creature that lives in the subsurface ocean and hunts by ambush, crushing its prey and consuming it while still alive. Saralyn looked like she was about to be sick, her silver fur now matted with nervous sweat, and her tail wrapped tightly around her body. Kyle felt a little sorry for his classmates, because they seemed genuinely traumatized by these recordings, while he was mostly just curious about the biology behind each creature. The fifth recording was perhaps the strangest, a low moaning sound that rose and fell in pitch, like some kind of alien whale song, but with an underlying tone that made Kyle's teeth itch. The Void Caller, Professor Thalvek said quietly. A creature that exists partially in normal space and partially in dimensions we cannot perceive. And its call is said to drive beings mad if they listen for too long. Kyle had to admit this one was a bit creepy, but it still did not really scare him, because he had learned a long time ago that sounds were just sounds, and the real danger was always in the teeth and claws. The professor looked around at his traumatized students with something like satisfaction, and then his scales shifted to a deep red that Kyle had learned meant anticipation. And now, Thalvek announced, we come to the final recording, and I must warn you that this one is considered the most disturbing sound in our entire database. The few students who had started to relax immediately tensed up again. This recording comes from the human homeworld of Earth, the professor continued, and it was obtained by a survey team that was mapping the primitive planet before humans achieved space travel. Kyle sat up straighter, genuinely curious now about what Earth predator could have scared a team of aliens so badly. The survey team described the creature that made this sound as a large feline predator that stalked them through mountainous terrain for 3 days before they managed to escape. The image on the screen changed to show a grainy photograph of something moving through trees, and Kyle immediately recognized the tawny fur and long tail. It was a mountain lion, also known as a cougar or puma, one of the most common large predators in North America. Kyle had seen dozens of them over the years, and while they were certainly dangerous and deserved respect, they were not exactly monsters. The professor pressed play, and the sound filled the room. It started as a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the seats, and then it rose into a screaming roar that seemed to contain all the fury and hunger of a pure predator. Kyle recognized it immediately as the territorial call of a female cougar, probably warning other cats to stay away from her territory and her cubs. Around him, the classroom exploded into chaos. Saralyn actually screamed and bolted for the door, her claws scrabbling against the smooth floor as she tried to run. The Drevnock curled into a tight ball, all of its rocky plates locking together with a grinding sound that made Kyle wince. Corvani students were changing to pure white and pressing themselves against the walls, their forearms wrapped around their bodies. Even Professor Thalvek stepped back from his podium, his scales flickering through every color in rapid succession. And Kyle Bennett, the only human in the room, started to laugh. It was not a mean laugh or a mocking laugh, just the genuine amusement of someone who had heard that exact sound many times before while camping in the mountains around his home. Everyone in the room stopped moving and turned to stare at him. Kyle realized he was the center of attention, but he could not stop chuckling at the absurdity of the situation. "I am sorry," he managed to say between laughs, "but that is just a cougar." The silence in the room was so complete that Kyle could hear the ventilation system humming in the ceiling. Professor Thalvek's scales slowly shifted to a confused purple, and his forearms hung limply at his sides. "I beg your pardon," the professor said, his translator making the words come out flat and stunned. Kyle wiped his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "A cougar," he repeated, "or mountain lion, or puma, or catamount, depending on where you live, but they are all the same animal, and they live in the mountains near where I grew up." Saralyn had stopped her flight and was staring at him from near their door, her golden eyes wider than Kyle had ever seen them. She asked, "You know what made that sound?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kyle nodded, still smiling at the memory of all the nights he had heard that scream echoing through the valleys around his home. "Sure," he said, "I have heard that sound dozens of times, and it is actually kind of pretty once you get used to it." The entire classroom continued to stare at him in complete silence, and Kyle began to realize that he had just revealed something very important about humans. They didn't scare easily. The classroom remained frozen for what felt like a very long time, with every alien student staring at Kyle like he had just grown a second head. Professor Thalvek was the first to recover, his scales slowly shifting from confused purple to a more stable gray as he processed what the human had just said. "Mr. Bennett," the professor said carefully, "are you telling me that you regularly encounter creatures that make that sound?" Kyle shrugged, not understanding why this was such a big deal. "Well, not regularly," he admitted, "but often enough that it does not really surprise me anymore. And my dad always said that a cougar scream sounds worse than it actually is." The Drevnock slowly uncurled from its defensive ball, small pebbles falling from its body as it stared at Kyle with eyes that looked like polished obsidian. "Your species lives with those creatures?" the rocky alien asked, its voice coming out like stones grinding together. "We live with all kinds of predators," Kyle said. "Bears and wolves and cougars and alligators and sharks and a whole bunch of other things that can kill you if you are not careful." Saralyn had walked back from the door and was now standing at the end of Kyle's row, her tail still puffed up, but her ears slowly rising back to their normal position. "How is that possible?" she asked. "How does your species survive on a world with so many deadly creatures?" Kyle thought about the question, because it was actually a good one that he had never really considered before. On Earth, humans just accepted that dangerous animals existed, and they learned to live alongside them, but apparently that was not normal in the rest of the galaxy. "I guess we learned to adapt," Kyle said finally. "We figured out which animals were dangerous and how to avoid them or deal with them when we could not avoid them." Professor Thalvik approached Kyle's desk slowly. His back, in what Kyle had learned was a gesture of deep thought among the Corvani. "Mr. Bennett, this cougar creature," the professor said, "how large does it grow?" "A big male can weigh around 200 pounds, Kyle said. "Maybe a bit more in some areas." "And does it hunt your people?" Kyle nodded, because there was no point in lying about something that was well documented. "Sometimes," he admitted, "there are a few attacks every year, and occasionally people get killed, but it is pretty rare, because cougars usually avoid humans if they can." The professor's scales flickered to a pale yellow that Kyle recognized as fear. "And yet you continue to live in areas where these creatures exist." "Of course," Kyle said with another shrug. "We are not going to let some big cats push us out of our own territory." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Kyle realized that he had just said something that sounded very different to aliens than it did to humans. It did to humans? On Earth, refusing to give ground to predators was just common sense. But to these aliens, it apparently sounded like something an even more dangerous predator would say. Saralyn sat down in the empty seat next to Kyle, which surprised him because she had seemed so afraid of him before. "Tell me about the other predators on your world," she said, her golden eyes fixed on his face with intense curiosity. Kyle spent the next hour talking about Earth's wildlife, while the rest of the class listened in stunned silence. He told them about grizzly bears, which could weigh over 1,000 pounds and had claws the length of human fingers, and about how his uncle had once been charged by a grizzly while hiking in Alaska and had survived by playing dead. He told them about wolves, which hunted in packs and could bring down prey much larger than themselves, and about how his grandmother remembered when wolves had been brought back to Yellowstone. And people had actually been excited about it. He told them about great white sharks, which could grow to 20 feet long and had been swimming in Earth's oceans for millions of years, and about how humans actually paid money to get in cages and watch them up close. He told them about crocodiles and hippos and elephants and Cape buffalo, all animals that killed hundreds of humans every year, and about how humans kept building towns and farms right next to the territories of these deadly creatures. By the end of his explanation, the entire classroom was looking at him with expressions that ranged from terror to awe. "Your world sounds like a death trap," one of the Corvani students said, his scales a sickly green color. Kyle laughed and shook his head. "It is actually really beautiful," he said. "You just have to know what you are doing and respect the wildlife." "Respect," Professor Thalvik repeated, his translator making the word sound strange. "Alien." "Sure," Kyle said. "These animals were on Earth long before humans existed, and they have just as much right to be there as we do. So we learned to share the planet with them instead of trying to wipe them all out." Saralyn leaned closer, her silver fur catching the artificial light. "But you said your species hunts these animals as well," she pointed out. Kyle nodded, seeing no reason to hide this fact. "We do," he admitted. "We hunt them for food and sometimes for sport, and we use their fur and bones and other parts for all kinds of things. But we also protect them and make sure they do not go extinct." "You hunt the things that hunt you," the Drevnok said slowly, like it was trying to understand a very difficult concept. "Of course," Kyle said with a smile. "That is what predators do." The room went silent again as every alien in the classroom processed the implications of what Kyle had just said. Had learned to survive alongside predators. Humans were predators themselves. predators that had clawed their way to the top of one of the most dangerous ecosystems in the known galaxy. Professor Thalvek finally broke the silence, his scales shifting to the deep blue of respect that Kyle had rarely seen from the Corvani. "Mr. Bennett," the professor said quietly, "I believe I owe you an apology." Kyle tilted his head, confused by this statement. "I selected the Cougar recordings specifically because I thought it might humble you," Thalvek admitted. "I wanted to show you that even humans can be frightened by the dangers of the universe." Kyle just smiled, thinking about all the nights he had spent in the wilderness, surrounded by sounds that would apparently terrify most of the galaxy. "No apology needed, Professor," Kyle said. "But maybe next time you should ask a human what scares us before you assume anything." Sarah-Lynn's whiskers twitched in. What Kyle was learning was the Falafi equivalent of a smile. "And what does scare humans?" she asked. Kyle thought about the question for a long moment, and then he gave her the most honest answer he could. "Other humans," he said. "We are the most dangerous thing on our planet." The class ended shortly after that, but Kyle could tell that something had changed in the way his classmates looked at him. They were not just curious anymore. They were afraid. The weeks that followed the incident in Xenobiology class were strange for Kyle, because he went from being ignored to being the most talked about person on the entire station. Everywhere he went, aliens would stop and stare, whispering to each other in languages that his translator could barely keep up with. Some of them seemed afraid of him, stepping out of his way in the corridors, like he was a predator that might attack at any moment. Others seemed fascinated, following him at a distance and watching everything he did with intense curiosity. Kyle tried to ignore the attention and focus on his studies, but it was hard when his classmates kept asking him questions about Earth that made him realize just how different his homeworld was from the rest of the galaxy. "Is it true that your planet has storms that can destroy entire cities?" asked Morvel, the young Corvani, who had become Kyle's lab partner after the Cougar incident. Kyle nodded, thinking about the hurricanes and tornadoes that regularly swept across parts of Earth. "Yeah, we have hurricanes that can be hundreds of miles wide, and tornadoes that can level everything in their path, and earthquakes that can shake whole cities to rubble." Morvel's scales shifted to a queasy green color. "And your people rebuild in these same locations afterward?" "Usually," Kyle admitted. "We're kind of stubborn that way." Sarah-Lynn had become a constant presence in Kyle's life, always sitting next to him in class, and joining him for meals in the station's cafeteria. At first, Kyle thought she was just curious about humans, but as the days passed, he realized that she was actually trying to understand something deeper about his species. "Your people have only been in space for a few decades," she said one evening as they studied together in the observation lounge. "Your technology is centuries behind most civilizations in the galaxy. Already considers you one of the most important new species to emerge in thousands of years." Kyle looked up from his tablet, surprised by this statement. "Really?" he asked. "I thought most species barely knew we existed." Sarah-Lynn's ears flattened slightly, which Kyle had learned meant she was uncomfortable. "The Council knows," she said quietly, "and they are worried." Kyle set down his tablet and gave her his full attention. "Worried about what?" he asked. "We do not have any interest in conquering anyone or starting wars." "That is not what concerns them," Sarah-Lynn said, her tail wrapping around her legs. "What concerns them is how quickly your species adapts and grows." She pulled up a holographic display that showed a timeline of human technological development. 300 years ago, your fastest transportation was a horse," she said, pointing to early images from Earth. 200 years ago, you had just invented steam engines, and 100 years ago, you were still using chemical rockets to reach orbit. Kyle nodded, not seeing what was so strange about this. "Now you have achieved faster-than-light travel, and established colonies on 3 different worlds. Saralyn continued. In just 300 years, you went from horses to starships. That does seem pretty fast when you put it that way, Kyle admitted. It is unprecedented, Saralyn said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. The Corvani took 12,000 years to make the same journey, and the Falathi took nearly 8,000, and the Drevnok are still using slower-than-light ships after 15,000 years of civilization. Kyle stared at the timeline, finally beginning to understand why his species made other aliens so nervous. Humans did not just survive, they exploded outward, growing and changing and adapting at a pace that the rest of the galaxy could barely comprehend. Are like a fire, Saralyn said. A fire that grows and spreads and consumes everything in its path. That is not really fair, Kyle protested. We are not destructive. We just like to explore and learn and build new things. Saralyn looked at him with her large golden eyes, and Kyle could see something complicated in her expression, a mixture of fear and respect, and something else he could not quite identify. That is what makes you so frightening, she said softly. You do not even realize how dangerous you are. Kyle was about to argue with her when his communicator buzzed with an urgent message. It was from Professor Thalvik, asking Kyle to come to his office immediately. Kyle looked at Saralyn, who nodded for him to go, and then he made his way through the station's winding corridors to the faculty section. The professor's office was filled with holographic displays showing predators from across the galaxy, and Thalvik was standing in the Omen middle of them all, his scales shifting through colors that Kyle did not recognize. Ah, Mr. Bennett, the professor said when Kyle entered. Thank you for coming so quickly. Is something wrong? Kyle asked. Thalvik was quiet for a moment, and then he gestured toward a chair. Please sit down, the professor said. I have been doing research since our class on predator sounds, and I have discovered some things about your species that I find deeply troubling. Kyle sat down, wondering what the professor could have found that was so concerning. I have been studying human history, Thalvik continued, specifically the ways your species has dealt with predators over the millennia. The professor pulled up a series of images showing various Earth predators, and Kyle recognized most of them as animals that were now rare or extinct. Humans did not just learn to live alongside predators, Thalvik said. You systematically hunted them to the edge of extinction across most of your planet. Kyle shifted uncomfortably, because this was true, even if modern humans had tried to reverse some of that damage. We made mistakes in the past, Kyle admitted, but we have been working to protect endangered species for over a century now. That is not my concern, Thalvik said, his scales shifting to a deep purple. My concern is what this pattern reveals about human nature. The professor brought up a new display showing a graph of human population growth over the past 10,000 years. Every time your species encountered a new ecosystem, Thalvik explained, you followed the same pattern. You eliminated the apex predators, reshaped the environment to suit your needs, and expanded until you had filled every available space. Kyle wanted to argue, but he knew the professor was right. Humans had done exactly that, spreading across every continent and every climate zone on Earth, pushing aside anything that got in their way. And now, Thalvik said quietly, you have begun to do the same thing in space. The professor brought up a map showing human colonies and exploration routes spreading outward from Earth like the branches of a growing tree. 3 colonies in 50 years, Thalvik said, with plans for 30 more within the next century, and your population growth rate shows no signs of slowing down. Kyle looked at the map and felt a strange mixture of pride and unease. We just want to explore, he said. We want to learn about the universe and find our place in it. Thalvik's scales shifted to the deep blue of respect, but there was also a trace of yellow fear mixed in. I believe you, the professor said. I believe that humans genuinely do not see themselves as conquerors or invaders. But Mr. Bennett, neither did the Vorthax. Kyle felt a chill run down his spine at the comparison. Creature, he said firmly. No, Thalvek agreed. You are something far more effective, because the Vorthax killed everything it encountered through violence and force. But humans transform everything you touch through adaptation and growth. The professor leaned closer, his forearms folded in front of him. You do not need to conquer the galaxy, Mr. Bennett, because in 1,000 years you will simply be everywhere, and the rest of us will have no choice but to adapt to you. Kyle sat in silence for a long moment, thinking about everything the professor had said. He wanted to argue, to insist that humans were peaceful and cooperative, and would never harm the other species of the galaxy. But deep down, he knew that the professor was right. Humans were not just survivors or predators. They were something else entirely. Something the galaxy had never seen before. And Kyle was beginning to understand why that made everyone so afraid. The semester was coming to an end, and the annual Xenobiology exhibition was only 2 weeks away. Every student was required to present original research to faculty and visiting dignitaries from across the galaxy. And Kyle had been working on his presentation for months. He had chosen a topic that he knew would be controversial: a comparative analysis of predator-prey relationships on Earth versus other known worlds, with a focus on what made human evolution unique. Sarah Lynn helped him prepare, spending long nights in the library going over data and refining his arguments. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked one evening, her golden eyes filled with concern. "This presentation is going to make a lot of species very uncomfortable." Kyle nodded, because he had thought about this a lot since his conversation with Professor Thalvek. "They need to understand us," he said. "Not fear us, or worship us, or try to contain us, but actually understand what we are and where we came from." The day of the exhibition arrived, and the main hall was packed with beings from dozens of different species. Kyle had never seen so many aliens in one place before, and for a moment he felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. Then he remembered all the nights he had spent in the wilderness, alone with nothing but his wits and his training, and he felt the nervousness transform into something else: confidence. He walked to the center of the presentation area, and the crowd fell silent. "On most worlds," Kyle began, his voice steady and clear, "species evolved to avoid predators entirely, developing camouflage or speed or defensive mechanisms that allow them to flee or hide." He brought up holographic displays showing various alien species and their evolutionary adaptations. "This is the universal pattern, the response that nearly every intelligent species in the galaxy has developed when faced with adversaries. Predatory threats." Kyle changed the display to show images of ancient humans, small and vulnerable looking, against the backdrop of prehistoric Earth. "Humans took a different path," he continued. "We were never the fastest, or the strongest, or the most naturally armored, and our ancestors were prey for millions of years before they became anything else." He showed images of early hominids being hunted by saber-toothed cats and giant hyenas and massive crocodiles. "But instead of running away from predators, we did something that no other species in the galaxy has ever done," Kyle said. "We studied them." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "We watched how they hunted," Kyle explained. "We learned their techniques and their weaknesses and their patterns, and then we started using those same techniques against them." He showed images of early humans working together to bring down a mammoth, their simple spears coordinated in a boxer way that no other Earth predator could match. "We invented tools to extend our reach," Kyle said. "We created weapons to enhance our strength, and we developed language so that we could share what we learned with others." The display changed to show human hunters from various cultures throughout history. But the most important thing we developed was persistence, Kyle continued. The ability to simply refuse to give up, no matter what the universe threw at us. He showed footage of humans running marathon distances, climbing mountains, swimming across oceans, and surviving in deserts and ice fields and jungles. Most predators in the galaxy are specialists, Kyle explained, perfectly adapted to their specific environment and prey. But humans are generalists, adequate at almost everything and masters of adaptation. The audience shifted uncomfortably, and Kyle could see scales changing color and fur bristling throughout the crowd. Environment does not suit us. We change it, Kyle said. When we encounter a new predator, we learn its weaknesses and either avoid it or eliminate it. And when we face extinction, we find a way to survive. He paused, looking out at the assembled aliens. You played us a recording of a cougar and expected us to be afraid, he said. But every sound on that list, every predator you showed us, reminded me of something we have already faced and overcome. Kyle brought up the final display, showing Earth from space, a blue and green jewel surrounded by the darkness of the void. The galaxy thinks humans are newcomers, he said, primitives who barely deserve attention, but we are not primitives, we are survivors. He let the words hang in the air for a moment. We crawled out of the mud and learned to walk upright, Kyle continued. We survived ice ages and plagues and wars and famines. We watched extinction-level asteroids kill the dinosaurs, and then we climbed out of the rubble and kept going. His voice grew stronger as he spoke. We did not crawl out of a hostile world, tooth and claw, to be afraid of anything the stars might hold. The exhibition hall was completely silent as Kyle finished his presentation. Saralyn was the first to react, her padded paws making soft thumping sounds as she began to applaud. Others joined in, the room filling with the varied sounds of appreciation from a dozen different species. Kyle stepped down from the presentation area and was immediately surrounded by beings who wanted to ask questions. Professor Falvek pushed through the crowd, his scales shifting to the deep blue of respect. Mr. Bennett, the professor said, that was perhaps the most remarkable presentation I have witnessed in 40 years of teaching. Kyle smiled, feeling genuinely grateful for the praise. Thank you, Professor, he said. I just wanted them to understand. Was quiet for a moment, and then his scales shifted to a more thoughtful gray. I must admit, the professor said slowly, when you first arrived at this station, I believed humans were simply another young species that needed to be guided and protected. Kyle nodded, having suspected as much from the beginning. I no longer believe that, Falvek continued. I now believe that humans may be exactly what the galaxy needs. Kyle tilted his head, surprised by this statement. What do you mean? He asked. The professor gestured toward the crowd, where representatives from dozens of species were still discussing Kyle's presentation with animated interest. The galaxy has grown stagnant, Falvek explained. We have been at peace for so long that we have forgotten what it means to struggle, to adapt, to grow. His scales shifted to a hopeful orange that Kyle had never seen before. Humans remind us of what we once were, the professor said, before we became comfortable. Before we stopped reaching for the stars. Kyle thought about this for a long moment. We are not here to save anyone, he said finally. We are just here to explore and learn, like we have always done. Falvek nodded, his forearms folding behind his back. I know, the professor said, and that is exactly what makes you so valuable, because you do not even realize the gift you bring. Saralyn appeared at Kyle's side, her silver fur gleaming under the exhibition lights. It is time to celebrate, she said, grabbing Kyle's arm with surprising strength. You have just changed how the entire galaxy sees your species. Kyle let himself be pulled toward the doors, but he paused at the threshold and looked back at the crowd. Aliens from dozens of worlds were still talking and gesturing and debating, all because one human had refused to be afraid of a cougar's scream. He smiled, thinking about his father back on Earth, who had taught him to respect the wilderness and the creatures that lived there. "Thanks, Dad," Kyle whispered to himself, and then he walked out into the station's corridors. The galaxy was waiting, and humans had never been good at standing still. They were predators after all, and predators always moved forward, always searching for the next horizon. Kyle Bennett was just the first, but he would not be the last. Humanity was coming, and the stars would never be the same.